Alright, ready? You're listening to the Medicalize This podcast. I'm Lenway.
And I'm Tremaine Ansani.
We like medicine to protect us from what we don't want. No skip heartbeats, no trouble breathing, no blood clots, no back pain, no broken bones, no open wounds, no upset stomach, no cold, no fever, no tumor, no cancer, and give us what we want. A healthy heart, a healthy pair of lungs, a healthy brain, a healthy stomach, intact bones, normal body temperature, cells that divide like they are supposed to in our body, so we can live comfortably and longer. We trust our doctors to do their job well, and our doctors in turn trust us to be good patients who give them the information they need to solve the puzzle of our body when it breaks down. Rarely do we question why doctors do things the way they do. For obvious reasons. Doctors have gone through years and years of medical training to get to where they are today. They are the experts, we are not. They know the science and they know what they are doing. Today's guest took the seemingly simple questions of what do doctors do and traced the intellectual, social, and cultural currents that have shaped modern medicine. His name is Adam Rodman, and he is a medical educator, internal medicine physician, and storyteller. You may know him through his medical podcast called Bedside Rounds, which explores the story of how modern medicine came to be through historical accounts that span thousands of years. In my conversation with Adam, we talked about what it means to bring a historical lens to medicine, what lessons we can gain from studying historical events, and how history can inform the way medical professionals conceptualize and communicate uncertainty in healthcare. Before we go on, let's hear an excerpt from Adam's podcast 70th episode titled A Doctor's Work.
In the same period that modern diagnosis has developed, let's say roughly the middle of the 19th century through today, 2022, the daily work of a physician has changed dramatically. But the stories that we tell ourselves about our work, stories that illustrate both our ideas about our own field, but also reflect greater cultural understandings of the work of physicians, have stayed remarkably the same. On Bedside Rounds, I talk a lot about how our imagined histories, nostalgia, if you want to call it that, as opposed to the messy actual history of modern medicine came to be, can be so harmful to physicians' well-being and how we care for our patients.
Adam, welcome. Thanks for taking the time to be with me today.
Lee, of course. Anybody who wants to talk about like the history of medical epistemology, I am down. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. It is my belief that in order to fully understand a person, I have to understand their origin story. So the way I would like to start is by understanding the most significant context from the earliest years that are responsible for the person you are today. So, Adam, who are you?
Who am I? I wasn't prepared for this question. Okay, so how did I end up like I am today? Like, how did I end up as a skeptical physician / medical historian / artificial intelligence researcher? All right, so I am what I don't even know if we use this lingo anymore, but I am what might be called a non-traditional applicant, right? So when I went to college, I had no idea that I wanted to be a doctor. I actually thought I wanted to get a PhD in either economics or public health, doing like econometrics. So medicine, not on my mind. And my first job out of college, I guess you could call it a gap year, but my first job was for an economic policy think tank. And I hated it. I thought it was intellectually interesting, but I hated sitting at a computer analyzing data all day. So I made some stupid decisions, and I thought that I would, because I had planning to get a PhD, I had most of my prerequisites except organic chemistry. So I took those while working full time. I got a C. Don't recommend that. And yet somehow I got into medical school, and had a lot of like imposter syndrome, as you can imagine, going because at this point I'm 3 years out of college. So I worked for the policy think tank for like 2.5 years. And then I did what you did. Once I got into medical school, I went and traveled. I did some fun stuff before medical school started. But once I got there, like I felt like I was completely out of water. Like I hadn't prepared for this. And a lot of my colleagues, I've been thinking about this since they were kids. My children want to be like a paleontologist, and Charlie wants to be an astronaut. He's 3, an astronaut who plays basketball. So those seem like more typical child things, but some people want to be a doctor from the time they're little. So I felt like I didn't belong. And one of the things, and I continually felt like that really throughout medical school. And I took this course my 4th year of medical school that was taught by Chad Miller, who's now at the at SLU at St. Louis University. That was like, it was called the Advanced Internal Medicine. But what it was is it was really a course about how doctors think and what that means. So like we read Sherlock Holmes, we went to the New Orleans Art Museum and looked at paintings. My favorite thing, we like followed people. It's kind of creepy in retrospect. I don't think you can do it now, but we like followed random people around the French Quarter of New Orleans. And then we had to use our powers of observation to describe them to one of our colleagues who would like sketch that out. I mean, that's okay in New Orleans. If I did that in Boston, people would not be very happy with me. So, I mean, that really, I think it was fun, and they were kind of incoherent thoughts at the time, but it got me into this like, okay, well, there's more to just like basic science to medicine. When I was an intern, so I went to Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. That was, I was disabused of that pretty quickly, because as an intern, you spend like, there's some interesting medicine, but largely you are a working monkey. And I just did tons of work. You're working all the time. It truly is 80 hours a week. And I actually, if you're asking like what made me me, this is the moment. So I think it was November. November in Oregon is cloudy and rainy all the time. It is pretty depressing for like 5 months, though the other 7 months of the year are absolutely beautiful. So that's why people do it. And I was sitting in the VA ward room with my resident, and we had like an honored guest speaker who came once a year. And this speaker was Sal Mangione. And I don't know if you ever met Sal. He's at Jefferson. And he's this like really humanistic, he's Italian, this very humanistic guy. He loves Leonardo da Vinci. And he's really good at telling these stories that bring in the bulk of humanity. And I remember I was like, okay, I'll go to this Grand Rounds. I didn't normally go to Grand Rounds because it's at 8 a.m. and that's like when I have to do work. And if I don't do that, the rest of my day will suck. This is a fundamental problem in medical education. But I went, and I'm not even kidding that what I saw in that like changed my life. It was basically like an intro to Sal, but he talked about, I think the story that he told that really affected me is he talked about the Emperor Hadrian, and how it's a story about Dr. Petrakis. I don't remember his first name. This doctor from the 70s who was like on his honeymoon and saw a bust of the Emperor Hadrian, and he had a Frank sign, this diagonal earlobe crease. And because this was a guy who kept up with the medical literature, he knew that was an independent like risk factor for coronary artery disease. And then he like quickly dragged his new wife across Europe to go look at other busts of Hadrian as a young man, saw it all there, and then wrote this like really cool paper suggesting that Hadrian had actually died of heart failure. And there were all these like colorful ideas of how Hadrian had died. And for me, like hearing that story, and there's some other stories there, it really made it click for me that medicine and the practice of medicine, it doesn't have to be this super specialized, like scientific experience, but it really is hooked into this bigger question of what it means to be human. And it's not like I got a lot of experience of that when I was a resident. Actually, probably the best thing I did was listen to Radiolab. I love Radiolab, a huge inspiration. I am the doctor I am today because of Jad Abumrad and Robert Krulwich, and the current hosts, Latif Nasser and Lulu Miller. I love them as well. But I was, I would listen to Radiolab every morning. I'd just seen Sal, and in Radiolab, it's a science show, right? But it's not about boring, like reading textbook science. It's about the people who do the science, the people affected by the science, how it connects to all of humanity. So these two things were like weighing on me. And this is this is before Serial came out. So this is before podcasts were very big. In fact, Radiolab was still fundamentally a radio show at the time. I just listened to it as a podcast. So I had this like crazy idea that, I wanted to do something, I wanted
Mhm.
to explore more, and I decided to start my own podcast. And if you listen to like early episodes of Bedside Rounds, which I will tell you, virtually no one listened to, maybe my mom listened. I think the lowest one had like 30 something listeners within 30 days, which is not particularly impressive. Well, you know what? 30 people is great, right? 30
Yeah.
people is an entire lecture classroom. So I shouldn't say that's not great, but it was not like a hit. But those first episodes were me like exploring, right? Me reading papers that I thought I was interested in, trying to integrate that into my own experience.
Mm.
And I really did this throughout residency, I think maybe 11, 12 episodes. And then I finished residency. I I'm like, I can't just get a regular job. I'll be so like
Mm.
I've been doing the same thing for 3 years. I don't want to just keep doing that. So it was like a coin flip between going to Alaska to work in the bush, or at a hospital, but also in the bush, or going to Southern Africa to Botswana to do a global health fellowship. And basically, a coin flip. I went to Botswana, and I moved to Boston because it's Beth Israel, which is where I am now. And I have this like decision to make. What do I do with the podcast?
Mhm.
And I hadn't made up my mind, and I was actually at the Countway, the Harvard Medical Library, which I spend all my time there now. But yeah, it was like a touristy thing, and I saw Phineas Gage's skull, and you know the story of Phineas Gage, right? You'll be taught it in med school. He was a rail worker. He had a tamping iron, set off a spark, shot the tamping iron. He lobotomized himself, and then so the story goes, had all these personality changes. And what was really interesting is, well, someone robbed his grave, and his skull and the tamping iron are there. He actually he went with P.T. Barnum on tour around the country. And in medical school, you'll learn all these stories about Phineas Gage and the dramatic like personality changes he went through. What is really interesting is at Countway, they actually had a piece that was published in NEJA and the New England Journal of Medicine, sitting right below him, that deconstructed a lot of those myths, that in fact
Mhm.
Phineas Gage like went back to work. He like had loved ones. He had like really productive life until he finally died of epilepsy, probably from his brain injury. And what was very clear is that there was a historical narrative around Phineas Gage that really besmirched him, that wasn't true, that was made to tell just so stories about neurobiology, because it came in this context of we're trying to move to localize. It's at the very beginning of localizing brain injury. So Phineas
Mhm.
Gage was a very attractive stories for those doctors. So I consider that my first modern episode, because I actually dug into the primary sources, because there are primary sources, like you can just read what the doctors who treated him said, and how that narrative changed over time. And
Mm.
from there on, I don't remember, that's maybe episode 17, but from there on out, my show became much more of an explanation, and it really reflects my growth of a physician, of how we know things and what that means for how we practice medicine. And a large theme that evolved throughout Bedside Rounds is obviously like curiosity. I want people to explore, but I also want people to realize that, often history is shown as, oh, look what those silly people in the past did. But in fact, by understanding the past, one, we can understand the present, where the trends are, but we can also be more skeptical about the things that we take for granted. Because, I mean, everything that we do is incredibly historically contingent. There are a lot of medical decisions that we do that have very little basis in evidence. And there are honestly some big assumptions we make about medicine and medical care that we never really interrogate, that our field discourages us from interrogating. So I think over time, Bedside Rounds became much more of an academic podcast.
Mhm.
I wrote a book, so I ended up writing a book. I partnered with the American College of Physicians, and it really, I think, because I did a lot of exploration of epistemology, especially around diagnosis, so I was very familiar with the literature like surrounding the historical development of diagnosis. So when powerful AI technologies, came onto the scene, it turns out that being a historian of these things makes you very well suited to like actually explore some of those technologies. So in that sense, Bedside Rounds has been another way, like it's launched a writing career, and it's also launched into a research career. And I was researching educational technologies, digital
Mhm.
education prior to that. So like first to teach people how to become digital educators, and now more of like thinking about the future of medicine and the future of medical thought, being inspired, or not inspired, but informed by the past. That was a big answer. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes, that was an amazing summary of your life story. So you went from studying history and economics in college to
Mhm.
medical school and then to residency where you went to this talk by this person and got inspired by them, and then went on to make a podcast about the medical history. It's amazing. I would like to, ask you about what inspired your interest in history initially.
That's a great question. So when it comes to medical history, I actually like to frame it not so much as an interest in history, but as a exercise in curiosity, right?
Hmm.
And there are as many ways that you can be curious. For me, historical understanding of the contingencies of why we do things is an act of curiosity, right? And there's different frames, but like if I want to understand, like,
Mhm.
why do we use Lasix in the way that we do? There's a lot of ways you could approach it. You could
Yeah.
look at the physiology of the glomerulus, look at the ascending loop, the loop of Henle. But for me, like what I like to do is say, okay, well, why was Lasix introduced? Read some of those early, like read about diuryl
Mhm.
and some of the documents surrounding diuryl, even going back further about arsenic and the arsenic diuretics, and then look at some of that early evidence of Lasix, and you realize that some of the Lasix dosing we just adopted from diuryl, and people went crazy with diuryl because it was so much better than these arsenic-containing compounds. And when you read it that way, it gives you a different understanding than a physiologic understanding, but you
Yeah.
understand that the way that we do some things is because some other people did it and some other people did it, and there's all these historical contingencies. So that for me is why history and is interesting, is those frameworks give another for me at least another
Mhm.
frame to like express curiosity. Not that that's the only way you can do it.
Got it. Got it. Hmm. So you are a internal medicine doctor, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do as an internist?
So as an intern, so I'm a general internist, and I'm a true general internist, meaning that I could never ever make up my mind on what I wanted to do. So I am, well, right now I'm just a hospitalist. So I take care of hospitalized inpatients. Up
Hmm.
until January, I also worked in a clinic where I would work with medical students, and I did chronic illness management and urgent care. So I was actually a clinic doctor as well for almost 8 years, but I just don't have the time for it anymore. It's also very hard to be a clinic doctor.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and I work sometimes by myself, but more frequently I work with trainees. So I work with interns and residents and medical students. And then I'm a medical educator. So I am one of the core members of the faculty at Beth Israel. So I do a lot of teaching of the residents. I run a faculty development a resident development course and a faculty development course, teaching people how to teach, right? So really both theory and practical things. And I run that with Shreya Trivedi, who is my
Mhm.
colleague here at the BI. And I'm a researcher, right? So I'm an really a clinical reasoning researcher. And I've been doing reasoning research for a while, predating like the popularity of AI.
Oh.
But since LLMs have shown themselves to be capable of reproducing human like reasoning outputs, a lot
Mhm.
or virtually all of my research has been in large language models. And I run that lab
Hmm.
with one of my colleagues at Harvard Medical School, Rajman Rai. So that's what so I do everything, right? I could never make up. I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, and now I do a lot of many different things.
That sounds interesting. Like being able to do a variety of stuff that you like to do and having the freedom to do it must be blessed. What is an internal medicine doctor? Because it doesn't make sense to me to call like what internal medicine is. Is it just medicine about the inside of the body? Is there like an external
Yeah.
medicine?
Yes, there is. You mean you want the historical? So I'll explain what it is,
Yes.
and then the historically contingent reason we have our name. Internal medicine is what you might call general medicine in other countries. So internal medicine is
Mm.
medicine. You go and see a doctor as an adult, you're seeing an internist.
Mm.
House, right? JD from Scrubs. They're all internists. Like your typical prototypical general doctor is an internist. Why is it called internal medicine? It's actually a very old word, and it's one of these things that we took that in America. So America pre-World War I, American medicine was obsessed with German medicine. It was called the German school. Actually, a lot of the words that we now just use without thinking are
Yeah.
in medicine are German words that we just took. And then World War I happened, and we changed the names of a lot of things. But in German, dermatology was known as externe medicine, or external medicine, because dermatologic diseases, so syphilis then was considered a dermatologic disease. Anything that manifests primarily on the skin was visible and therefore didn't need diagnostic tests to diagnose. Inere medicine, or internal medicine, and when it was translated directly into English, was the contrary of that. It was medicine, but medicine for which you would need diagnostic tests, which at that point is things like auscultation, so using the stethoscope, biopsies, specific gravity bottles, but they were diseases that you couldn't just diagnose by looking at the skin. So in the US, we initially had the British terminology for medicine, which would have been general medicine, right? They don't, but then we just, in our rage for all things German, adopted the Innere medicine and translated it to internal medicine, and that name stuck. And it's been confusing people ever since.
I always wonder what's the difference between, internist and other kind of doctors, like family medicine doctor, and I guess they just like the training that you receive may be different. And
family medicine is a newer specialty. So again, if this is going back 100 years, originally you would just do an internship, and then most people would go and practice independently, and those people would be called general practitioners. As as the 20th century went on, medicine became more complex. Everyone finished a residency, so a new type of residency emerged called family medicine, which was the purpose to give a structured, originally 3-year, I think now many programs are 4 years, but a structured program to basically be like a general practitioner. So an internist, for example, would not do surgery, right? We would never do an appendectomy or deliver a baby. A family medicine doctor, now I'll be clear, like most family medicine doctors don't do this anymore, but their training does allow them to do like basic surgeries and deliver a baby. So it's like the modern equivalent of what a GP used to be, because even though you technically, I think, and legally could in most states practice with only an internship, you wouldn't be board certified. And I'm pretty sure almost no one does that.
Let's talk about your historical work. Is your process similar to a historian, or is it different? I don't think you're not a historian by training, or at least I don't think you are. Right?
I'm not. No, I was enrolled in a master's course, but I dropped out because I was working full time. No, I think that question determines whether I'm writing for a podcast or whether I'm working on historical scholarship, because I have written history papers. Yeah. When I write a historical paper, my process is very similar to a historian in that I have like a question and I do archival research to answer that question. When I'm writing a podcast, though, it's not, right? Because a podcast is really influenced not to answer, like the goal is not to answer a historical question. I'm not looking at the historical literature and saying, these are the gaps. This is what I want to answer. I mean, sometimes, especially some of my more recent episodes have been answering questions that there is no scholarship on. But my goal, I don't go into it saying, this is the gap in the literature I want to explore. Rather, I look at my practice or contemporary medical practice and work backwards. What am I curious about? Why did this happen? And then I let that curiosity process take me back in time. I mean, and in practice, it ends up looking a lot different, because if I'm doing historical research for like a paper, I definitely do a lot more archival research, right? I really want to read everything that I can within certain domains. When I'm working on a podcast, I'm really just looking to answer that question and then allowing my curiosity to let me go. So some of my podcasts do have many primary sources, but my historical literature is exclusively primary sources, right? I'm just reading what people wrote. When I'm working on my podcast, I certainly rely more on secondary sources. And a primary source is like something that was a historic artifact, something that was actually written by people in that situation. A secondary resource might be like one of my papers, right? It's something else that somebody has analyzed and put their thought into that's based off of that. So the amount of work is probably not that different, but it's a different process. And I would say that they're both processes of like curiosity, but a history paper starts with a very clear like historical question, gap in the literature. What do I want to discover so I can inform other people? A podcast that I do, I mean, I guess I am influenced by my audience, but fundamentally it's for me, right? It's something that I'm curious about. And because of that, it does not meet the some of them I think meet the intellectual rigor of a historian, but most of them do not, right? And they're more to satisfy myself.
I would like to hear about. So you done podcasting for almost 10 years. You started in 2014, right? So it's 10 years.
Wow, I
Um,
hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, it's been a decade.
yeah, it's a long time. So what is your favorite topic that you have covered so far?
My favorite episode so it's tough for me to extrapolate this because I think when I have to put myself back in the state when I wrote it. My favorite episode, and I'm going to pull up the number so I can actually tell you, is 1 second. Let's go.
Yeah.
The Cursed Bedside Rounds is episode 43. So this is from 4 years ago. It's called The Curse or The Cursed. El Hinchado in Spanish. But this is a question that came from a Reddit post, actually, right? So everyone always liked. There's this meme that'll go on any sort of historical Reddit where people will post the autopsy results from Charles II of Spain, which is that when he died, it showed, and I'll just quote because I've got my show notes up, a heart the size of a peppercorn, a head full of water, and a body devoid of blood. So everyone is like, how does that make sense? How could that possibly have happened? What is the scientific explanation for how his autopsy looked like that? And why I like this episode is that's just the wrong question to be asking. Like, obviously, he did not have a heart the size of a heart the size of a peppercorn. That is physiologically impossible. So the question that we really should be asking is, why did the physician who did that autopsy describe his autopsy like that? Right. And in order to understand that, you get into really interesting ideas of the clinical gaze, le regard, like the epistemes in which we practice, how we structure knowledge, what is acceptable knowledge, what is not. So it's like this episode I love because I think it's the first one that I did like this. It's how Carl Sagan writes, if we want to bake an apple pie, first we must invent the universe. So it's kind of that, like, if you want to even ask this question, we have to establish the basis by which we can ask acceptable questions. And it requires scholarship that's completely out of bounds with how most people, with how most doctors think about the world, which is to think of it from a purely rationalist physiologic point of view and really focus on the structure of knowledge and acceptable questions and what the bounds of those knowledge are. So it's one of these things that starts there and launches into a complete tangent before actually bringing it back to the social context. And at the end, I actually do answer the question.
Yeah. It's crazy how doctors back then describe things using kind of funny language, like comparing a heart to peppercorn. And for me, I think talking about the role of language, I think many language or terminologies that were used by physicians back in the day, that are no longer relevant in modern medicine, but some are. Like, for example, malaria. Malaria, mouse means bad, and area means air. So I think the theory back then was just because we have malaria, meaning that you breathing bad air. That's what caused malaria. But it's true to a certain extent. So I think it's interesting that language can be such a funny thing, in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever stopped to think, why do we call it a stroke? Where does that come from?
Maybe because I don't know. Where did that come from?
It's translated directly from Greek. It dates back to the ancients, and it's because somebody who's struck down with a stroke, it's like the stroke from the gods, right? So it's a wonderful word because it is, I mean, malaria is, as you know, is not actually that old a word. That's like the 16th century, but still it carries these old ideas forward. There's a lot of things. There are honestly a lot of words that we use in common parlance that we don't think about that are like that. Some of them are too medically jargoning to get into. One of my favorite things is I'll see my residents will write that somebody has a bleeding diathesis sometimes. And a diathesis is a hereditary predilection to something. And for some reason, we still use the word bleeding diathesis instead of like hemophilia. But it's like this idea that comes from the early 19th, late 18th and early 19th century, when we used to think, oh, TB comes from a tubercular or a consumptive diathesis, that there's something genetic predilection that makes people get tuberculosis, and there's a bleeding diathesis. So it's like this it's not pre-modern, it's a modern idea, but it's like a pre-germ theory, pre-pathological anatomy, or very beginning of pathological anatomy idea, that we still use those terms that are now kind of divorced, but no one stops and thinks, why do I say this?
Sometimes,
Those words are all throughout medicine.
yeah, some words just don't make sense, but I don't know. It did make sense back in the day, but back to the podcast, your podcast, Bedside Rounds. What were your visions when you started this podcast? Yeah, did you expect it to be popular like it is today, or did you just want it to have a creative outlet or an outlet for you to, share your knowledge about medical history?
It's a great question. So, first of all, when I started making Bedside Rounds, there was not a conception of podcasting as a way to, like, that was a pretty foreign concept. There were really, I mean, I don't want to say there were no medical podcasts, but it was basically people reading articles. There was like nothing there. There was no conception. The conception of the podcaster, which is like obviously a meme at this point. Like you can watch, there's Only Murders in the Building. It's about podcasters. Podcasters show up. That was not a conception that somebody would be a podcaster. So when I started a podcast, blogging was the thing that was like really popular when I started it. So for me, it was fairly avant-garde that I decided to start a podcast. And very explicitly, like, of course I wanted people to listen to it, but very explicitly early on, the focus was selfish, I guess, right? It was for me. I was making it for me, and it was cool if other people listened. It wasn't for several more years that I started to change my conception of what the show was, and that I had an audience, and that like it was contingent on me to put out good quality, like things that I was proud of, good quality material, rather than it just being a chance to listen or a chance to experiment. And that also, I think, tracks with how the larger medical community changed towards podcasting, right? When I started, I mean, the story that I like to tell is when I started, I'm a second year resident. I think I actually started technically intern year, but I didn't release it until right after my second year. And my program director like told me he was very concerned about what I would not associate program director was very concerned about what I was putting out, and like told me that I should stop and do something else instead. So like people didn't know what to make of it. And obviously I never listened to anybody, so I didn't listen to him clearly. But so yeah, I think it's much more recent that not much more recent, but that wasn't when I started it. That wasn't my thought. I think it's different these days because there are models. Like I teach people how to podcast, right? And it is hard. It is not easy to podcast. It takes much more. When you listen to an episode, it actually, well, it takes a lot of time to put a podcast together. But now people definitely have much more of a conception of what they're putting together when they put together a podcast. And they definitely have that identity of a podcaster and sort of models to look for. And there are resources, right? I mean, these days, there's so many ways to learn how to do it.
I mean, I agree with the point that podcasts, I think, have exploded especially since COVID, because people wanted to, it's easy to bring on guests and talk about stuff. I like podcasts because it is such a nice way to meet new people and interact with them, and then speak with the experts on certain topics. So one thing I like about Bedside Rounds is how relevant and how it speaks to this knowledge. It taps into the knowledge of history of medicine and how we can all learn from it. And one thing that it resonates with me is the fact that our current medical practice comes from a very weak foundation, but we still believe. I mean, many people think that medicine is absolute, it is objective, but the reality is it was produced by the people of the time that they were in, and definitely they were influenced by what was going on in their society at that certain time. Yeah, I think
Yeah, I
it's
mean that's what I want. That's kind of the big picture goal of what I want to get at. I wouldn't say that it's a weak foundation. What it is it's not this imagined, like this is a story we tell ourselves about the hard science underpinning medicine. And that's exactly the point, right? Medicine is both historically contingent. It is very contextual on like the societies who, including our own society and the esoteric pieces of that. And there certainly are pieces of medicine where we know things very well. There are
Mhm.
many more things where we only kind of know, and there's some things that we don't know at all. And I think the lesson for practitioners today is to like understand those gradations. There's not like a corpus that is medicine that is good, but this like ramshackle of different types of knowledge that we try
Mhm.
to use to make people better. And
Yeah.
some of the things probably harm people. Some of the things definitely do make people better. And if like what I want from healthcare practitioners listen is just to realize that, right? To be skeptical about just so stories that we tell about medical knowledge, because some things do. I mean, like my God, the COVID vaccine is one of the coolest medical discoveries and inventions of all time. mRNA vaccines, how quickly we developed it, how effective it is. So modern medicine is capable of doing pretty amazing things like organ
Mhm.
transplants. That's crazy. So it's not. I don't want people to be like, oh, modern medicine doesn't work. It definitely works, but it is not like God did not. Oh my! What is the with the Ten Commandments? What's that mountain? Is that Mount Ararat?
Yeah, yeah.
But these things are not do not come down from stone on stone from God, and
Mhm.
that Moses is descending. Right? They are human creations with all of the fallacies and assumptions that go into human knowledge, and in many ways. The practice of medicine, I think lawyers don't have this problem, but the practice of medicine is a lot like the practice of law because it's
Mm.
really the sifting of different types of medicine, in this case, to help an individual. And just like lawyers, we don't always get good feedback, right? We make a decision, but we don't often know, did the patient just get better? Maybe they just don't come back. And we don't get this like feedback loop on how we do.
Right. Sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty in medicine, especially as doctors. How do you use history or historical stories to connect with patients and just like let them know that doctors work is not always based on doctors always operate on uncertainty with like in what they do. So do you let them your patients and their families know that what you doing in terms of diagnosis, in terms of the tests you order, it's just an attempt to lower that uncertainty. Not
That's a really insightful question. Yeah. So I like in practice, I'm not often talking about history with my patients, though you get the occasional person who wants to talk about that or is interested. But rather it's exactly that, right? If being a historian and making the podcast has taught me anything in communicating with patients, it's how to communicate that uncertainty and how to like talk about your own uncertainty because there are things like when I'm taking care of somebody that I am more certain about, there are
mm,
things that I'm less certain about. And patients both want to and deserve to know about their doctor's level of uncertainty. And sometimes there's like big mismatches. Like I've certainly taken care of patients when they look really skeptical, and I'm like, look, guys, this is something I'm pretty sure about. Like there are
mm,
other things not, but this is something that I like actually know quite well that I've seen many times before. So and this is something I think that all doctors like grok to a certain extent. Experienced doctors, right? You've been doing this long enough. You'll very quickly get it beat out of you that we know everything or the conceit of medical knowledge. So I don't think these things are controversial in that sense. It's just that I think the formal study of history gives me more of a framework to think about these things rather than like just grokking to intuitively know something.
Speaking of uncertainty, in episode 68 of Bedside Rounds, it's titled "The History," where you talk about the history of clinical reasoning, and you kind of like discuss a medical case with Doctor
With Gurpreet
Gurpreet
Dhaliwal, yeah.
Dhaliwal. I like that episode a lot.
You
Um,
mean when I pull that I think it's from oh my God, what's his name? It's from Mendez da Costa's book from the 1850s, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Can you just basically like, summarize that episode just for the audience, and then talk about what stood out to you during your conversation?
Oh yeah, that is one of my. Sorry, I should have said that's one of my favorite episodes. Obviously, I adore Gurpreet Dhaliwal. He's one of my biggest influencers and heroes. So in that episode, what we go over the concept of taking a medical history, right? So taking a medical history, it's called a history. If you want to get really pedantic, we have this phrase "poor historian" in medicine, and a poor historian is somebody who can't give you a clear history for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons. And if you want to be really pedantic, doctors always like the historian. There's no such thing as a poor historian. The historian is the doctor, not a patient. That phrase, it's fair enough. You shouldn't be mean to your patients, but it's always driven me crazy because the word historian actually refers to the patient, because everyone thinks of historian as like an academic professional, but in fact, it's just 100 years ago. And the actual definition of a historian is someone who tells a story, meaning that the patient is a historian. So, when people are pedantic about that, I'm always pedantic back to them. But so there's this question on how we should take a history. And this is a debate that's really relevant today. And the basis of the question is, well, does a history reflect the reasoning of the doctor, right? Do I ask questions that are influenced by the information that the patient is telling me based on their chief concern, what brought them in? Or should I go about it in a scientific method to collect as much information as possible, and only after collecting all that information sort through it? And this was a big debate in the 1850s, which is pretty remarkable because arguably at that point, they're only like one or two generations away from the beginning of modern medicine, right? So like in a older humoral or an iatrophysical model, there'd be no need to do these things. So it's only, since let's say the 18 teens that, this is Mendez da Costa's in America. So really it's one generation. When Mendez da Costa was in medical school, doctors were still talking about the humors. So but he's like reflecting this debate that we still feel today. And this is a underlying debate on is taking a history, is the practice of medicine fundamentally a human task that is mediated through the patient giving the story and the physician taking the history, right? And their thought processes, or is it I'm going to do air quotes, a scientific task where the job is to collate as much information as possible so that we can use some rationalist method. Da Costa's writing in the 1850s. He doesn't have a sense of computers, but it wouldn't be long before people are like, we should use counting machines, or then you get to the 50s, we should use computers to do this. And it's been a tension, and that has really affected, and there's been pendulum swings, but that has affected our profession for 200 years, 150 years. And what I really like about that episode is we basically go back to the beginning. Mendez da Costa is the first person in English that I know of. There are French sources that are earlier that really discusses this. And he's like, people were very smart. He's bringing up debates that I think are above the discussions that most doctors have today. And there's a lot of relevance to our current practice to even just reading that chapter and thinking about it. And that's one of the reasons that I had Gurpreet go through that case, because you can see that even though the terminology is older and we didn't have antibiotics, but he reasons through it in the exact same way that Mendez da Costa would use.
So what exactly is a clinical reasoning, and what does it mean for a doctor to make a diagnosis? I think like you talk about that with Dr. Dhaliwal, and I'm curious to know what is your definition of clinical reasoning?
You're asking great questions. So I think the answer to this, that there's no single answer for what is clinical reasoning. I would generally say clinical reasoning is the study of how doctors make all decisions related to patient care. Now, there are many different frames to look through this. We can say, okay, we're going to look at the psychological process. It's like dual process theory of how humans organize information. We could look at more we could look at the biases. So some people say clinical reasoning is being aware of cognitive biases that you have, like anchoring bias. You could look at like situated cognition. Clinical reasoning is how you make decisions under stress within the constraints of the healthcare system. So all of those are acceptable definitions of clinical reasoning. And I think most scholars these days would talk about a trans-theoretical approach, meaning there is no like clinical reasoning is how doctors make decisions, but there's no single frame to look at. And you have to look at like how the individual or group practices or makes decisions in the actual world. What is diagnosis is also an interesting question, because it's one of those things that has a simple answer that's incredibly complicated. So making a diagnosis is fundamentally a categorization tool. So you have a nosology, you have a disease classification, and making a diagnosis is simply picking a single or multiple possibilities within that nosology, within that disease classification. That's what diagnosis means. I have a clear answer for that one. Now, the problem is, as I talk a lot about this in Bedside Rounds, is, well, that's much easier said than done. And the degree to which we are certain or even able to sort into individual categories has so many contingencies, including like psychophysics. So the ability, test characteristics, the ability of a test, like knowing how well a test actually predicts something, and how much variation there might be between individuals, with contextual factors, patient preference factors. So it's one of these things that sounds easy, but is quite complicated. It is more straightforward than clinical reasoning as a whole, though, right? So clinical reasoning is far more complicated than just the process of diagnosis.
Would you say diagnosis is a part of clinical reasoning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In general, I think you could, this is simplifying, but you could split clinical reasoning into diagnostic reasoning and management reasoning. Diagnostic reasoning being, what do you think they have? Management reasoning being, what do you want to do about it? We haven't really talked about management reasoning a lot. The frameworks for, really, we've only been studying it for about the past decade, but management reasoning is far more complicated than diagnostic reasoning and much higher fraught, because the decisions, like what constitutes a reasonable decision, is incredibly contextual. An example, I think David Cook told me this, he's the leading scholar of this, is imagine that you have a heart attack, a STEMI in Boston. Well, the standard of care is to get you to the cath lab in under 90 minutes, right? To open up that blocked artery. Now, let's say that you're in a rural community in Alaska. The standard of care, no matter how much money you might be to like give streptokinase and take a couple aspirin. And that is still a reasonable decision because of the context of where you are and what's available. And then when you start to mix in other factors, you can kind of see why it's so hard to know what the right decision is. That's why it's so hard, like medical malpractice. Why is it so hard to know what is a reasonable and not a reasonable decision? Is because management decision making is incredibly contextual and complex.
I want to take this the rest of this conversations to talk about your reflections on podcasting. So you've done 10 years of podcasting with Bedside Rounds. Have you have a moment where you feel like the study of history was going to be part of your career? And what does this show mean to you?
So that's a great, these are great questions. Yeah. So I did not start Bedside Rounds on the thought that it would be a part of my career. I started it for very selfish reasons, as a way to explore the things that I want, as an outlet for my curiosity. If I were living in another age, I would have probably done something different. Now, it has been a part of my career because I think a fundamental trait of me is to like be very curious and also be a bit of a pain in the butt. And maybe a little bit of a workaholic. So it's not that podcasting itself is like what I wanted or planned out to be part of my career, but that the motivating traits behind it are. So a lot of my focus initially was on education, right? If you want to change things, education is generally a good way to do about it. So because of Bedside Rounds, I launched an education research center. We launched multiple courses. We now very proud to say Beth Israel is a center of really a center of digital education scholarship and production, right? A number of the major medical podcasts are made here, and we certainly have a pipeline to produce new people, also innovation in other ways, which is very exciting. Same reason that I'm doing like artificial intelligence research. It's something that I'm very curious about, and like in many ways, I think that probably there'll be more impact in education is a very slow impact. Theoretically, you teach your learners who teach their learners, but it's it's certainly not a way in which you have a rapid impact on anything. And artificial intelligence has been a very interesting field because a lot of these same tools and same methodologies and same framings that I've developed through my podcast now inform my research and my grants and those sorts of things. So it's, again, and I think if you're looking for advice for yourself, that's how I would approach podcasting. It's an outlet. It's a way to have new experiences, interesting experiences. Very few people will ever make any sort of living from it. And really, you can at best cover your operating costs, especially for medical podcasting. I mean, some people have built a sustainable model. That's never been my goal. And yeah, it's just a reflection of my underlying motivators.
So just to wrap this conversation up, I have one last question. I mean, two questions. What lessons can we gain from studying historical events and patterns? Why should people care about history at all?
So yes. So why should people care about history? I think this is an interesting question. First, I'll say why we shouldn't care about history. So you shouldn't care about history because there is something inherently good in learning about the past. And I think this makes me different from other academic historians, right? I don't want to study, like, let's say there was an extinct civilization that was on an island somewhere and had no, like, I wouldn't care about that. So I don't think it's all right if people do, but I don't think there's inherent good about learning about the past because of that. The reason I think learning about history, well, there's two. So reason number one is we all live in the present, and everything that we do, literally everything that we do, is historically contingent. I've said that word a couple of times. What does it mean? It means that the reason that we think the way we do, the reason that we do the things that we do, is because of decisions that were made in the past, usually under very specific circumstances. So understanding the historical contingencies that led to the present can help us make better decisions about today. We've talked about some examples here, like how confident am I of this medical decision? But there's all sorts of things, like this is a trivial example, but there's this tradition called pre-rounding where the attendings will make their poor interns wake up patients while they are still sleeping, so to round initially before rounding with the attending. I think it's the stupidest tradition. It is the stupidest tradition. And if you pre-round on the show, I'm sorry, I don't really respect you. That's not true. I respect you enough, but please think about what you're doing. The reason pre-rounding exists is that in the old days, and this is just like 2 generations ago, there were no attendings in the hospital. It was just the residents, and the attending would come like once a week, if that. So the residents had to pre-round, that is, round on their own on the patients, and then the attending would come and be actual rounds. And then the model shifted so that attendings are always in the hospital, and this tradition stayed, but it's historically contingent. And to this day, you'll have my colleagues, some of whom I respect, who write like these op-ed pieces on pre-rounding is so important, but none of them have stopped to like think about how their strongly held opinion is historically contingent. And things like that happen again and again. I mean, all of society, it's not just in medicine. So that's number one. And then number two is, and this is less about history and more about the humanities, the study of humanities, and like really the study of humanities, which is, I guess, a study of the artifacts of humanity, of our written artifacts or any videos, all those sorts of things, gives you a different understanding of the cooperation and structures between humans than studying the sciences. Because the sciences, especially the hard sciences, are really like abstractions of a pure world. The humanities gives you methodologies to think about how humans work and function in groups. And it gives you a language and frameworks to think. Because ultimately, even if you're a scientist, you're still interacting with society, and humans are like, fundamentally, we are what? We're great apes. We're relatively hairless great apes who evolved in hunter-gatherer societies on the African savannah, who now live in a post-industrial world with all these sort of like weird constraints. And studying the humanities, of which history is one of them, is a great frame. And fundamentally, like, my role as a physician is similar to a shaman in a traditional society. And it gives an understanding of some of the cultural resonance of medicine. Not that the science isn't important, but apart from that scientific part.
I genuinely thank you for what you're doing with this podcast, with everything. And so what advice would you give to young people who wanted to study history, but they want to have more like, how do we make history more accessible to people instead of making them read textbooks that are just too dense, too long to read? How do we make history more engaging?
Great question. And I think, so I'm not going to say this for anyone who wants to be an academic historian. Like, I'm fundamentally a physician, not an academic historian. My advice for young people, especially in medicine, is to less think about it as history and more think about it as curiosity. So try to engage that curiosity about the world, about your patients, about medicine, and explore that. And over time, develop a method for you to explore that curiosity. And it doesn't mean you have to go engage with primary sources. Like, I often read books that are 150 years old. You don't need to do that. We are actually spoiled for good, like the internet. There's a lot of crappy stuff on the internet, but right now there are some amazing like YouTube channels. There's wonderful podcasts that you could listen to. Like, if anyone asked me if I would ever be into food history, the answer would be, well, funny enough, the history of like cooking and medicine are very intertwined. But like, I watch Max Miller's YouTube channel all the time because I love the process by which he recreates historical recipes and does all this primary research. Am I going to do that myself? No, but like watching him, I get that like visceral satisfaction. Yes. So my message for young people is it's less about what you're doing and more about like the curiosity that you nurture inside and finding outlets for that curiosity. And it does not have to be primary research. I think that is something for people who are, I mean, I'm a bit of a crazy person. I think most people, that's not their idea of a fun time. Whereas I get, like, when I find something in the stacks that I've been looking for a while, I get a little thrilled. Or when I see the marginalia around articles, I love the old ads from like the 1940s. I'm like, this is so cool. So I recognize that that's not for everybody, but I think the underlying motivation can be for everybody.
Adam, thank you so much for coming to my podcast. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for sharing your stories, everything about the medical history there's to know about, and I genuinely appreciate our time together. Thank you. Thanks for listening. This episode of Medicalize This was produced by me, Lê Nguyen, and Jermaine Ansani. Special thanks to Kayla Wong, our editor-in-chief, for giving this episode the best shape possible. Our original theme music and additional music come from Blue Dot Sessions. If you enjoy the show, please help others find us by telling your friends about us, posting our episodes on social media, or leaving us a review and rating on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Lê. See you next time.